Agenda-setting financial insight now with our commentary arm Reuters Breaking Views. Today, it's banks, banks and more banks. Madrid hopes it's fifth time lucky as Spain tries to fix its banking system again by bailing out Bankia. And weak Chinese imports are a sign of that country's banking stress. With me now to discuss these stories is Reuters Breaking Views economics columnist Edward Haddis. Edward, let's start with Spain. The government's taking a 45% stake in Bankia, asking the country's banks to set aside 35 billion euros more in loan provisions on top of 54 billion. That's a lot of money. Is it enough?
We don't know. What you can say is that the Spanish government has consistently been too slow and too cautious in terms of estimating the size of the losses. And that's been one of the key factors in the market's lack of confidence in Spain. Spanish bond yields at 6%. Fortunately, of course, Spain started this crisis with relatively low debt, relatively solid fiscal position. So the question has always been, when you add up all the losses on property, will they be big enough to really cause a problem with the state? And because the state has been so slow in recognizing how big the losses are, investors are very doubtful. Each time the government has been more ambitious. This one's by far the most ambitious. The willingness to take an equity stake in the most troubled bank, which they just set up a few months ago, is a really good sign that they're taking the situation seriously. The big number is a good sign. Whether the market's going to believe that this time finally they've got it remains to be seen.
I mean, that's almost 90 billion euros they've asked the banks to set aside. Not easy to do given the precarious and fragility of those banks.
Yeah, you keep looking at the various pots of money from which you're going to draw. Are you going to get it from profits? Not enough. Are you going to get it from reserves? Those are open, exhausted. The government has its FROB, its rescue fund. That's also close to zero. It looks like the government will have to borrow some more. Can it do that in the open market? Good question. Ultimately, it may well be that we're going to need some official support to make this all work.
Ultimately, are we looking at Spain heading for a full sovereign bailout?
Well, we hope not, because if you manage to persuade investors to back this, then that will work on its own. But you can't rule it out. The question really then is, if you do need some kind of full bailout or almost full bailout using ECB money or some other in-between source relative to a true government rescue, can that be afforded? The answer is probably we still think yes. I still think yes, that this is all going to end reasonably happily, but
it's going to be a close call.
It will be uncomfortably close.
Okay, on to China. Now, just to, before we go into your answer, extraordinary import numbers out today. In April, imports rose 0.3%. Yeah. They were expected to rise 11%. Now, extraordinary in itself, but why does this pose serious questions about China's banks?
Well, there's a two-way flow here. On the one hand, the banks themselves are one of the reasons imports are low is that credit isn't flowing freely through the economy. And so the weak imports is a sign that the banking system isn't doing what it's supposed to do. The other problem that we're going to be highlighting in our note is that the banks have, the government would typically respond to weak growth by pushing money into the system through the banks. But if the banks don't have the ability to lend, and that seems to be the case, particularly the big state-owned banks, then monetary looseness will be less effective in China. And so there's a kind of quandary here of whether the banking system is really up to the job of doing the government's billing, and this weak trade number, the surprisingly weak trade number, suggests that there is a real problem, and the problem is actually in the financial sector rather than in the rest of the economy.
Well, that's not particularly good news if China's meant to be the engine of world growth.
It's not too encouraging. So China is both, the weakness there is reflecting the world's weak growth and may now start to amplify it.
Edward, thank you very much. My thanks there to Reuters Breaking Views, Edward Haddis. Well, for more agenda-setting financial insight, watch our US Breaking Views show every day at 12:30 Eastern at 17:30 BST. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.